when we talk about gender equity, sometimes it seems like a conversation in the distance. It seems like a concept, that is laying very loose. People use equality, people use equity, women's inclusion. For centuries, and more recently since the Beijing conference, and then we're looking at what has happened over the past year since then. We have, in the corporate world where, of course, there's a lot of conversations around gender inclusion, CSRs, but then, there's a common consensus around how sometimes, it might sound a bit tokenistic. We've had, conversations and a couple of stereotypes too within, the government environment, as well as, when it comes to gender equity, as, a lot of conversations around gender equity, yes, seems like posturing, because again, the numbers are stagnant. In some countries are retrogressing. The global economics is changing. We've seen couples of coups in the African region. Just a couple of days ago, in Nigeria here, where I said, it marked the 10th anniversary of the Chibok girls that were kidnapped, and just from some of the data that then emerged, is like, out of some of the girls that were, of course, released, 21 out of them, are mothers with over 34 children, and then they've lost over 41 family members. And then you can imagine the post-traumatic trauma when it comes to the psychological impact as well. We're looking at, the drought situation in some parts of Africa. We're looking at, just the dilapidated primary health care system in different parts of Africa. We're looking at also, dwindling agricultural productivity despite the consuming population we have in Africa. So, I mean, there's a whole lot. We're looking at unprecedented inflation in Africa as well. So really, this conversation is pause and think. Where do we start from? How do we get people to understand the consequential impact, and where do we go from here? And hopefully when people leave this conversation, is this more nuanced perspective and understanding, and people can then take this right to inform the work that they do. Yes. So again, I'm sure people have enjoyed to listen to me today, because we do have the experts in the room. So I'm going to yield to them. And we're going to start the conversation really with just laying a foundation and helping people understand from the perspective based on the work that we do, talking about the concept of gender equality, and talking about, why this conversation matters, right, within the area of play, which we currently work in. I'm going to invite you, first of all, Dr. Chukwuemeka, to start this conversation. Can I confirm Dr. Chukwuemeka is still with us? Okay, while we're waiting for him, I think we can kickstart with you, Benith. You currently lead the Commonwealth Women Parliamentarian Network with the Commonwealth Parliamentarian and Parliamentary Association, which is quite a strategic arm of parliamentarians. Parliamentarians is essentially, critical to the legal and policy landscape in any country, and shaping the entire socioeconomic landscape, given that they essentially are they're responsible for formulating laws and passing those laws into bills and into acts eventually. So let's talk about the concept of gender equity, and let's talk about why this conversation, around the interconnectedness of, inclusive politics, policy, and socioeconomic development is crucial at this point in time in Africa.
Thank you. Before I begin, I just want to thank you for the opportunity for joining this discussion, which is very, very pertinent, especially with the work that we're doing here at the CPA to promote gender equality. But again, in response to your question, I guess it's important to actually differentiate what is gender equity versus what gender equality is. As you rightfully mentioned before, it is a term that people use loosely, interconnected as well, but they do have different meanings. So when we think of gender equality, in a nutshell, that's just equal treatment, giving men, women, or persons of underrepresented groups the same thing. be it the same same rights to access to free healthcare, or the same legislations or covering them by the law. Everyone has the same right. But when we think of gender equity now, we bring in the angle of fairness and justice. So it's the idea that although men and women may be given the same thing, in reality, when let's say those things are given to the environment legislation, the experiences of men and women are not necessarily the same. And that's why it's important to have, women in my role when we talk about the CPA in decision-making positions, because research does show that when policies do not necessarily consider the perspectives or the experiences of women or underrepresented groups, that inequality persists in policies and programs and services that a parliament or government or anybody's trying to deliver to support a specific group of concern. And you find out that whatever the outcome of that policy is, when you don't include the voices of women, you kind of cater to the needs of that dominant group in society. Again, the IPU has released data, and it does it annually, on the representation of women in parliament, and that's something that the CPA does as well. And based on data that we gathered last year, September 2023, we've seen that within the Africa region, that there is probably, I think, a total of, well, collectively, there were 22 branches or parliaments, as what we call, that have under 5% women's representation in lower levels of the political chamber. Now, when we break that within, let's say, the Africa region, that's one, and that's particularly Nigeria, which still has 3.9% of women in the lower house. And of those 22 parliaments, 8 provincial parliaments, and just to clarify that the CPA represents and works with both national parliaments, but also subnational parliaments as well, meaning each provincial parliament, let's say within Nigeria or South Africa and Tanzania, also have equal membership within the CPA. But that data shows that of this 22, 8 parliaments, specifically provincial parliaments in Africa, have 0 representation at all levels of decision making. And unfortunately, those 8 provincial parliaments are subnational parliaments within Nigeria. So again, going back to the point that I mentioned, when you don't have women in that room or decision-making room to kind of champion and give that perspective, then you have policies that alienate a lot of people. And there's also understanding, again, I'll wrap up before handing back to you, that when we think of gender equity as well, yes, it's about fairness and justice, but it's also understanding that although women are there, it's understanding that women are just not a one-sided group. Within women as well, you have different intersectionalities. In the case of Africa, we know that, religion plays a huge aspect as well, age as well, language. So when we're thinking of having women in the room, and the importance of gender equity is looking at, when we have those legislations or processes in place, I'll be thinking of, number one, women, but also the diversity and the different range of women, and ensuring that they're at the table so that when things are developed, or when parliamentarians are considering policies, that they're considering women in their broader sense.
Well, thank you very much. That was very apt. And I mean, you've worked with different parliaments. I also love the fact that, you did reference some data around, the 22 branches having less than 5%. That is really disappointing, considering that women, constitute half of the population in Africa. And women also, also power the economy as well as consumers, as well. So definitely this has ripple effect on the economy, and on the socioeconomic outlook as a whole. But again, we will still delve deeper into that conversation. I just really want us to start with even explaining what the concept of what we're discussing is today. I don't know if Dr. Chukwuemeka is back. Please let me know, Tim. But I'm going to come to you, Yvonne. Sorry. Oh, great. Dr. Chukwuemeka, great. Thank you again for joining. So I mean, even as just talked about, the very gloomy outlook when it comes to the African continent in terms of women's representation in national parliaments, right? And, how that might shape certain policy directors. You are an economist, right? Let's talk about, what this means essentially. First of all, from your perspective, how do we even start distilling and bringing on the conversation around gender equity? Then I think my lead up to that question is, almost stakeholders, right? Almost different stakeholders start distilling this concept of gender equity, equity. And the reason I asked that, and from what Benita also echoed is, it seems like a loose conversation. We hear it all over the place, but as an economist, right, how can we understand in very simple terms? I know economists don't like to talk a lot, right? In very simple terms, how can we understand the gender of the conversation around gender equity? And why does this conversation around the interconnectedness of politics, inclusive politics, policy, and social and socioeconomic development really matter at this point in time in Africa? Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry that I'm going in and out. I'm not in my comfort zone. I'm on the field in Nairobi. And internet has been very good up to this moment. So please forgive me for coming in and out.
It's okay.
I think your question focuses on rethinking what we assume or what we know of what social development is. A simple narrative I always try to use when I'm discussing with stakeholders, so that they have a better grasp of the social and economic rationale for gender equality is from a cost perspective. So if we're potentially losing about 40 to 50% of our GDP because a large proportion of our populace are not being used to their optimum. And the question I'll ask you is, if you lose 60% of your income right now, will you be able to live your normal life? And that is very fair enough. You can see exactly what is happening currently in Nigeria and globally as inflation is rising and people are losing the real value of the nominal value of their incomes. You can see clearly that if you don't get the potential of what is expected from the resources you have, and then there's a significant cost to it. And this is very, very clear. What happens when we have historical imbalances that lead to gender inequalities is essentially that a large proportion of our economy, a large proportion of human resources do not contribute to potential GDP. And this is a problem. Now, what we try to do to redress this is to see how we can have both policies and programs that can help this disenfranchised proportion of our population to contribute effectively and then make our life better. So this is a very good way of framing it because what we see from even the last speaker, there's a cultural and religious barrier to even understanding the nature, the dynamics, and the scope of gender equality. So always look at it from a cost perspective. What are we losing? Is it possible that when we integrate more women, more youths, more persons with disability, that we can even have a better society? And there is enough data to show that this is in the affirmative. So what we essentially try to do is, having noticed this, sometimes change can come slow, but there are also low-hanging fruits where we can piggyback on and make significant progress. And I can give you some examples. For example, in both macroeconomic policies, as well as short and medium-term policies, especially from the finance perspective, as well as from the development perspective, we've been advocating to the government to start having what we call affirmative actions. Affirmative actions are actions that are temporal and are not there forever, but then they are put in place to address specific issues. And once those issues are addressed, then we pull out the affirmative action, because those who are targeted for those affirmative actions can now have enough capacity and contribute significantly if they have to contribute. For example, the government of Nigeria has just made a policy that 30% of all appointed positions will go to women and youths. This is an affirmative action. The idea behind this action is, by the time we start putting women and youths in such positions and they start performing, you will not even need a policy to become some of a norm. We're also working towards affirmative actions, for example, in the procurement process, where we've seen that women-owned businesses who are going to even feature more in the Nigerian economy. We have about 45% small and medium-scale enterprises identifying as women-owned. but that significant proportion of business cannot participate in public procurement processes. And we know that public procurement process is a way of injecting needed resources. So
I think we might have lost you again, Dr. Chukwuemeka. Can you hear me? So I will come back to you, but thank you for laying that foundation. And I love the fact that you said we should look at things from a cost perspective. So I love the way this conversation is shaping up.
I can hear you clearly. Can you hear me?
Yes, Dr. Chukwuemeka, yes, absolutely. So I'm going to pause for 1 minute, and I will come back to you because we're still going to dig deeper into the conversation around, the opportunity cost, which is an angle that we're going to be delving deeper into during the course of this conversation. And of course, we're going to be talking about affirmative action. So it's really critical that you talked about that, even as an economics, right? And when we're talking about how do we move on from here and how some of those things can actually be actualized. So let me move on over to you, Yvonne. You represent an interesting stakeholder group that is the private sector, essentially, and I would say that during the course of running the lecture, I mean, I've come from corporate, I've worked in government, before running the lecture, so it's almost like I've had my hands dipped in those 3 different sectors. And this conversation was quite important for us to add someone from the private sector, because again, the private sector are critical to economic development. They are the custodians of industry, essentially, right? And so actions and policies that are put in place will essentially translate, top to bottom and bottom to top. But one of the critical conversations in the space today is the culture of tokenism within the private sector, right? Where we hear things like people playing around with numbers, where we have seen of course, a lot of women going to the workspace, and there's a period of stagnation. And then at the C-suite level and the board level, having lesser women. Although we're seeing an evolution in a country like Nigeria, where in the banking sector we have more women right now. But I think one thing that has really raised that cause for worry is around CSRs, for example, CSR projects, right? How a lot of private sector institutions treat conversations around gender equity, as a CSR or as a nice to have, concept or project, within the organization, but not necessarily looking at, the broader perspective of it. And also the concept of the private sector being apolitical, well, within Africa mostly, but not really, being involved in how public sector functions or works, or holding the public sector accountable, like you'll find in some other stronger democracies where unions and the private sector are quite key to sustainable democracy, because again the policies essentially shape the business environment, and again that impacts the profitability at the end of the day. So I mean, from where you sit, you occupy an interesting portfolio, which is the director diversity and inclusion at a foremost financial institution. Why is this conversation critical at this point in time? And why must the private sector, right, champion and approach the conversation around gender equity with intentionality? That's number one. The second aspect is, why is it critical for the private sector to be as involved in the conversation around the role of women in public governance? Let's even forget wider politics, because I understand that there's a trigger when you hear politics. Immediately it's like, oh, I don't touch it, it's dirty, I don't want to get involved. But we're talking about lived experiences of individuals here. So why should the private sector be involved? Why should they go beyond the immediate work that you're doing within the organization? So actually paying attention to what is happening within the broader landscape of women inclusion in public governance. Over to you, Yvonne.
So there are so many dots to this, and just to help our audience, I'm going to try as much as possible to connect all of the dots. So a little bit of why I'm going to speak on this with the lens that I'm going to speak on it. So I work for a financial institution, and I've had a personal journey as well that can definitely support the fact that women definitely need to be economically empowered, and we cannot do that without the financial services sector. We absolutely can't. My first bank account was probably at the age of 18, 19. And ever since then, I've seen how just even having a bank account was able to empower me in different ways. IMF released an article, a peer-reviewed article in 2020 that actually showed that in 2011, there was some research done, and for sub-Saharan Africa, only 37% of women owned bank accounts, compared to 48% of men that actually own bank accounts. In 2019, I got a job to work for a company based out of the US. That was my very first international job, and they were going to pay me in dollars. I had no idea how I could receive that money through any of my bank accounts. And I became a client of Standard Chartered even before I started working for them. But Standard Chartered offered that opportunity for me. They were able to help me receive my money from the US, convert to Naira within the app, and easily spend. And then I started my master's in organizational psychology in the UK. So I then needed to pay my school fees in the UK in pounds. And then just having a bank like Standard Chartered was able to offer me that opportunity to do both. And that immediately, I would say, took me from one socioeconomic class and earning power to the next. And that really changed my life economically. But one thing that really helped was not just the products that they offered me, but my relationship manager. My relationship manager was literally worked with me to really understand what I could do to, save my money, what I could do to take advantage of the opportunities within the market, was literally financially educating me. And this was not what I had before I started using that service as a product, right? Before I started using their product. One of the things that the research, the peer-reviewed article from IMF also talked about was, what are the actual things that are stopping women from actually opening bank accounts? And yes, we have discriminatory practices. Yes, we have the demand side limitations, like, women need collateral to pay, to get loans and interest and credit and things like that. But the huge part of the hypothesis that was proven was that women self-select themselves out of applying for applying for loans. They select themselves out of getting credit for their businesses. And then you ask yourself why. There is a very low financial literacy among women in sub-Saharan Africa, especially in North Africa. And this is where the policies come into place. This is where the financial sector can do something about it. This is where we have to start advocating for, okay, how can we begin to make women understand that it is okay? How can we begin to financially educate women at the grassroots level, even at a professional level? Trust me, many women working in 9-to-5s that are earning a lot of money still are not as financially literate as their male counterparts. And really, so there's a thing there about financial behavior. And if women are not making the best financial decisions, they're not being as economically empowered and contributing as much as we can. And so the financial services sector plays a huge role here. And then every other private sector, what can you actually do to continue to educate women financially? And one of the ways that I know that the financial services sector can do this is by actually getting more women in leadership. Now, generally, on average, women in leadership in the financial sector is probably somewhere between 20 and 25%. But if you go lower within the organization, you can see that it's almost 50-50, which means that it kind of like declines when you get to the top. Now, in the UK, for example, which brings me to your second question, Vijake, is that there is a financial charter called Women in Finance Charter. And this is actually led by the HM Treasury, right? So we're talking about public policy here. We're talking about women who came together in governance to actually decide, you know, we want to hold the private sector accountable. We want to work with them, and we want to make sure that there are more women in leadership. Now, what they've done is that they've created a charter where lots of financial services organizations can go and actually sign a signatory and decide, you know what, we are committing to meeting a target of, say, 35% women in leadership in 5 years, and this is who is going to hold us accountable. And then they bring male allies as their accountability partners and figureheads for those projects, right? And externally communicate this. So I know my bank actually has one of those externally communicated targets, and we're signed up to the Women in Finance Charter. But Women in Finance Charter would not have been possible without women in the HM Treasury. And so it's very important. And then they do this and they work together with people like myself who work as diversity and inclusion directors to think about action plans. Okay, how do we meet this? How do we make sure that this works? But it is without having those women in leadership, other women, even in the professional services, in the workspace, cannot see themselves growing to that point, increasing their earning potential, increasing their earning capacity to actually contribute economically to the to their communities and all whatnot. So they definitely need those role models. That's one. We need more women designing products, financial products and financial instruments, because women actually would go through the articles and really see what the barriers are and put themselves in the position of the women that is on the end user perspective and think through, okay, what can I actually do to make sure that this product is actually beneficial for this woman? So we need more of that. And women need to also just see that there is a growth path for them within every organization that they're working. So I'll end it here until the next question, but this is literally trying to connect all of the dots, and you can really see how the private sector cannot keep quiet about it. We contribute, every work pays you, right? You need a bank account to earn. You definitely need a bank account to earn. You need to grow as well. You need to grow your money. You need credit as well. So we are definitely, especially the financial sector, would really, really contribute to this conversation.
I mean, even that is so fantastic. I love how you have mirrored your lived experience and really brought this conversation home, from talking about, owning your first bank account to then, opening a domiciliary account and, how you found yourself in this organization now, but also, taking it further to talk about the current dynamics within your organization and then going to how just that piece of inclusive policy is shaping the financial sector in the UK. And, how you have the HM Treasury, which is a group of women coming together to say that because we understand the importance of access to finance, because we understand the impact on women, and because we have lived experiences, we're putting those charters together as a piece of policy, and we want to hold financial institutions accountable. And, that really speaks to the conversation today, where we're talking about the interconnectedness of inclusive politics, policies, and socioeconomic development. So thank you so much for, really bringing that home. I can see Ina is here with us. Welcome, Ina, and thank you so much for joining us, despite, the orders you had in transit today. Ladies and gentlemen, I did mention that we have a legislator with us in the house today. Because really, what is this conversation without, someone in office who can really mirror their lived experience, right? As to how being a female legislator has really shaped, their policy perspective, but even the wider public policy environment, within their country. So please welcome with me, Honorable Ina Ngari. She is a member of the National Parliament in Namibia, it's really great to have her. I look forward to this conversation with you. And, for us, really, we're going to be looking from that. We're going to be looking to that rich perspective from you, just talking through your lived experience, but also through your interaction with different parliaments across Africa, and really talking about the policy landscape. What we're trying to do with this conversation is to ensure that we leave a lot of big conversations. What we have found when it comes to the conversation around gender gender equity is that there's a lot that is left to assumptions. The conversation is had very loosely, and what we're trying to do today is to distill. Now, we mentioned that this is a foundational conversation for future ones to come, and so you're the final piece of the puzzle. So welcome again, Honorable Ina. So I'm just going to start with your first conversation. So what we've done before you came is to really just pose the question around the understanding of the concept of gender equity to all the speakers today, and also, why this conversation is critical at this time. So I'm going to pose that question to you as well. Over to you, Ina. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. I've been, and my apologies for being late. I think in Namibia there's a saying that politicians are never late, they're just delayed. But I've been in transit all day, so I just arrived a few minutes ago. But I'm really glad to be here and to be a part of such an important conversation. I think when we look at gender equity, we not only consider fairness for women in spaces of politics, in business, but also for men. And I think that's where there's an intersection, and that's where I think one finds that there's an importance for us to also include men in this conversation of gender equity. In the political space, for example, we say a lot of things. Sometimes we say we want women to be in positions, but when it's about women representation in these critical positions in the political space, often we throw around capacity. Does this person have capacity? Do they have the intelligence? And do they have the ability really to perform and deliver in those spaces that we advocate for them to be in? And I think generally, really, we need to, and part of my journey as Member of Parliament has been about really dissecting this very important conversation and making sure that it reaches grassroots level. Now, in Namibia, in 2019, I got elected as a Member of Parliament at the age of 23. And one of the things that I realized was that because we have two houses of Parliament, the conversation is often very different. We just recently reached the 50-50 gender representation in the National Assembly of Namibia, but it's very different when you look at the National Council, which is the upper house of Parliament, what you would otherwise call in your country a Senate, where members of that house are directly elected by their constituents.
You appear to be frozen. Can you hear me, Honorable Ina? Okay, we'll just give it about 2 minutes, and then maybe we go back to the next conversation. But Benita, as you spoke, you came to mind where you talked about, diversity and intersectionality, that even where there are women, you need to consider those nuances as well. And, when you have women, you're thinking about religion, you're thinking about tribe, you're thinking about different things, and how this pretty much shapes the, the policy environment. And it's just to say that, there's not one single, one size approach, right, to the conversation around gender equity, but also sometimes it takes the very people, that have the same lived experience to be able to distill the different, intersectionalities, within this conversation. And I think that was one of the things she was trying to say, talking about the National Council, and the National, I think, Parliament within Namibia. Namibia has done quite well when it comes to the National Parliament in terms of the representation. And I think it will be interesting to get a sense of how this has shaped, the social infrastructure or landscape within the country, talking about healthcare, education, the pay gap between women, and and all the like. So hopefully we have Ina back really soon. So I'm going to come back to you, Dr. Chukwuemeka. Just before I lost you the other time, you were talking about the costs. Now, the good thing about and you shared an analogy talking about the 40-50 loss due to significant loss due to gender underrepresentation, and also then just the analogy around if you lose 60% of your income, what's going to happen? And I think that really brought some of the perspective. But now, what I want us to do with this next conversation is to really talk about, the opportunity cost in different contexts, right? Looking at today's world, in Nigeria as a chief economist. So let's use Nigeria as a case study, right? Nigeria has seen unprecedented inflation for the past 2-3 years. For example, we know the conversation around the naira to dollar, the dollar to naira rate, and how that has affected the economy even to the micro level. But we've also seen different things play out within the security landscape as well. So really is in the context of Nigeria, and I know you also work, with different colleagues across the continent. So, I mean, we're glad to, if you can bring in some other case studies across Africa. What is the opportunity cost at the moment? What is the opportunity cost of the lack of gender equity in political leadership within Africa? Citing case studies, during the course of your job. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity. I will look at it from different angles, not restricting it only to political participation, because there is an economic participation to political participation. There's an aspect of gender-based violence that limits women's effective participation in politics, as you would know. And then also, one of the greatest pushbacks to the progress we've made on gender equality so far has been the issues around conflict. So these are essentially opportunity costs. So look at it from retrospect. Now, if we didn't have conflict, we would have more women effectively participating more in the agricultural sector, for example, across West Africa. What we've seen is that in instances where there are conflicts, women and children are most susceptible to displacements. And what happens during displacement is that there's a burden of care that is placed on the woman as a responsibility to take care of the children. The children don't get education as at when due. There are higher possibilities of having sexual harassment, especially in places where they are not safe. So these are costs that can arise. From an economic perspective also, when there are economic recessions, we also see that the most vulnerable will be the most impacted during such economic recessions. So for example, we know that a lot of women-owned businesses as well as women entrepreneurs are recognized as very small or micro enterprises. And for small and micro enterprises to thrive, they need to have access to credits, not just credits, but cheap credits. And this has been a significant problem, especially now that there's a problem of inflation. You would know that no financial institution will lend you money below the inflation rate. So if you're having inflation rates as high as 29%, as we have now, it means that the cost of credit will essentially be above 29%. It means that we need to start rethinking what we understand as gender equality. We also need to rethink the mechanisms that we've put in place to address the issues around gender equality. So if we've put in place, for example, and this is from my experience working with a lot of commercial banks across West Africa region, is that they keep telling you, oh, we have this amount of funds for women entrepreneurs. And then when you meet the women entrepreneurs in Senegal, in Mali, in Niger, in Nigeria, in Ghana, their response is unanimous. I will not borrow from a commercial bank. And this is very clear. So you see, we need to find that middle ground where the needs of the women and the commercial feasibility of the private sector organizations like commercial banks can meet in the middle and essentially solve a problem. Let me say this very factually. It is the inability of formal markets to meet the demand that creates informal markets. Now, when we were speaking about financial institutions earlier, it kept coming to my thoughts. This is something that we've bothered ourselves in the office. Is it that rural women, women that have small and micro enterprises, do not understand how finances work? Is that really true? Or they don't understand how formal financial markets work? Because if you look deeper, and this is something that we're doing some research around, especially for micro enterprises as well as informal enterprises, is that when we look at them in the markets, they actually do thrive and have financial systems that benefit them within the context of these small micro enterprises and these informal enterprises. But when we try to transit them to formal enterprises and tell them, go and borrow from a commercial bank, and then the commercial bank gives them so many criteria, they say, no, I can't do this. So merging and rethinking the mechanisms that we've put in place, especially in recourse to economic shocks as well as economic recessions, are very, very important. In fact, there is no time than now that they have become more critical. Because without a woman being economically empowered, it will be difficult for her to exert her rights. It will be difficult for her to have voice. It will be difficult for her to have social capital. And this leads us to the aspect of political participation. I have a very radical view about political participation from my own perspective. And I'm not speaking as a staff of UN Women now. This is my personal opinion. I think we should, okay, let me be very careful also. I think that
Chatham House rules.
I think we should prioritize radical interventions that target young girls for political participation. And I'll give my reasons why. If you look at what we've done in political participation in retrospect in the last 10 years, in the last 15 years, in the last 20 years, especially in the context of West Africa. In East Africa, fantastic, but the context is different. In South Africa, fantastic, but the context is different. In West Africa, there is a serious cultural and religious context that is even more powerful than laws and policies. So for example, we have the Child Rights Act that has been domesticated in Nigeria, but still in Nigeria, we have the highest amount of children who are out of school. That is a
Dr. Chukwemeka, I think we've lost audio again, and we're going to patiently wait for you for about 1 minute because I think, we just lost you at the peak of that passionate contribution. So I don't want to distort that line of thought. So we're just going to wait for a minute until you come back. Okay, I think we've lost audio again. As I said, is on the field at the moment. So that obviously. Oh, perfect. Dr. Chukwemeka, we're waiting for you. Please continue. Yes.
I was muted from your own side. I don't know why.
So no, we actually heard you. Yes, we heard you up until you went up just now.
Okay, my point is, can we look for an intervention that is long-term, but ensures that it socializes at least 2 generations of young children? So if we say in the next 20 years, we want to have interventions in secondary schools, junior, senior, and universities, different interventions that reorientates both boys and girls about their role in political participation, is more likely to have a significant effect in 20 years' time than the processes that we use now. What we are using now are interventions that target political parties, government institutions, public officers, and women, elderly women, and sometimes younger women. What I'm saying is, can we even go lower and target the children? Can we teach them civic responsibilities? Can we start introducing it with realistic interventions that will affect them, with the possibility of having political participation improved in the next 15 to 20 years? That is my radical position. We are currently conducting some form of research where we have some form of treatment and controls to see how we can re-socialize both boys and girls so that in the long run, the boys will even create that space for the girls to participate in politics. These are my thoughts. And then lastly, let me stop with this. As we think about innovative mechanisms, as we think about new ways of advancing gender equality, it's also important that we start thinking about what incentives, at least in the near term, what incentives can we give to stakeholders and political actors for them to adopt gender equality tenets. And I'm saying this because if you understand the political economy of every policy, it is always based on interest. Can we incentivize those interests for gender equality? And I can give you a very typical example. The World Bank has this very, very, very fantastic program in Nigeria called the Nigeria for Women Initiative. Very fantastic program. It gives some form of cheap loans to state governments to invest in their society, but then gave a conditionality. For you to access these loans, you must all have what we call the VAP Act. For years, we've been trying to see how we can get states to domesticate the VAP Act. None. Immediately, we gave them an incentive that domesticate this VAP Act and you have these resources to invest in your state. We've seen that more than 34 states has domesticated the VAP Act. Can we now start having innovative incentives? When the government wants to give stimulus packages to state governments, when the government wants to give stimulus packages to private sector organizations, can we start including social and development incentives as conditionalities? You understand? Incentives also matter. Can we start giving incentives to members of the parliament? Can we start giving incentives to appoint individuals that have been appointed to ensure that those incentives, or in some instances, nudges, will drive them to implement gender responsive policies? These are some of the things that we are currently playing around with in UN Women in the Nigeria country office, as well as the West African region, to see how we can push and advance gender equality using especially macroeconomic policy. Over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Chukwuemeka. I mean, I love, what you said about the most vulnerable being the most impacted during conflicts, and then going to the economical aspect where you talked about, our access to credit, continues to play a significant barrier, and how sometimes, the lack of fit for market or fit for purpose products, within the informal economy, further deepens that financial exclusion, even when, there are interventions that are being rolled out. And then you went on to talk about, we're still going to talk about what can we do practical. And I love, how you said, your radical approach and all that. And I just kept laughing because it's quite important to have men actually be this passionate and champion conversations like this, especially when we are within a patriarchal system. And to what's even said about, male allyship and why it must be embedded, across all solutions when we're thinking about interventions or approaches to tackle gender exclusion. I like what you said about innovative incentives, or tying it into what the World Bank is doing and how, that influenced the VAP Act, which is quite critical when it comes to preserving and protecting the lives of, young girls and women as well. And you talked about, reorientation, going back, just ensuring that we can preserve this movement across generations and, embedding that into the curriculum, into civic studies, and all that. So we come back to that later. So I'm just going to pack that on one end and come see you, Bennett. I mean, you've walked across different parliaments, right, within Africa and outside, essentially within the Commonwealth infrastructure. And I think one question that I have is, when you compare countries that have a higher proportion of women, represented within the parliaments, to countries that do not have a decent, we're not even talking about, that high proportion, that do not even have, I mean, in Nigeria, for example, we've never been over 5%. at the national parliament, which is quite disappointing, despite the population and being one of the largest economies in Africa, right? So within this context, what are the clear manifestations that you've seen socioeconomically within these two different dimensions? So countries that have proportionate representation and countries that have less proportionate representation when it comes to women in parliament.
Thank you. Again, in terms of our role, we don't necessarily like to compare regions, specifically countries, because we don't want to get into that narrative of, comparison. I think one thing is to understand that, there are differences. Yes, there is improvement, but also the context is also important to consider where some of these countries are coming from. But to answer your question, yes, there is a difference with, high level countries that have high rates of participation with women and countries that don't. And a big one being, I guess, it's kind of the outcomes of what those parliaments do as well. So what you see in parliaments that have, let's say, high women involved is that you see that there is much more of a rally and push to advance issues that are of importance to women. An example being, let's say, South Africa. As a country, but also within our membership at the CPA, each provincial parliament of the CPA is provincial parliament of South Africa is represented at the CPA. So on face value already, you're talking about South Africa that has exceeded the international target of 1995 of 30%, which unfortunately many parliaments have not even met. And I think conversations that were had in the margins of CSW in New York is that at the rate that we're going on now globally, it's that goal of 30% will not be achieved until, I think, it's at 2063. So there's actually push to even have, reach for gender parity. But that's a conversation for another day because we're still struggling to meet 30%. But again, looking at South Africa, they've exceeded that 30% at the national level. But when you now look at the 9 provincial parliaments, 8 of those 9 have also exceeded that 30%. And now when you look at the role of women in South Africa, as of recently, I think the Speaker of the National Assembly was a female, but I think she's had to step down. So there's the Deputy Speaker, who's a man, is acting. But now at the provincial level now, out of those 9 parliaments, 8 of them have female presiding officers. So in those parliaments now, they have a very active women's multi-parliamentary caucus. And you see that in those parliaments, those caucuses are basically the link to society that I know within the South African constitution and their governing body regulation that there is I can't remember the name of it, but it's kind of a ministerial wing that's responsible for gender equality, and they hold government or parliament's account and ensure that there's gender mainstream in there. But you also see that the role of the Women's Multi-Party Caucus, they actually step in and make sure that the holding government account, but also working with, as what was mentioned earlier about, engaging with the grassroots, as Dr. Emeka had mentioned. So an example in South Africa, you see the women's caucuses, they're back in 2011, when they were legislating on their act on domestic abuse, which is an issue that is not necessarily bound to Africa, as an issue that plagues every country, even countries as the UK and the United States. But you saw that the Women Caucus was taking that leading role in ensuring that it was reaching out to grassroots organizations, ensuring that it was reaching out to civil society stakeholders to ensure that their opinions were fed into that legislation. So again, that's an example showing that when you have those women in those in high levels of positions in parliament, but also women just involved, that you get that push that will lead into socioeconomic improvement. We know that domestic abuse affects women, in that for those women who are affected by it, some of them have to flee and go to safe houses, meaning economically, you're unable to support your family, support yourself. And in some countries that we know that as women flee, they may not have the support system of their family, meaning that children will have to now enter labor, or the labor force at a young age. So there is a ripple effect. So ensuring that, when women are in place, when they're thinking of legislation, they're thinking of, the perspective and the experiences of women, and ensuring that that manifests and is followed through legislation. However, I must say that having women in parliament is not necessarily the key to gender equality or gender equity. And I have an example that I would like to share that's not necessarily within Africa, but again, we have many parliaments within our membership that pride themselves on having, exceeded that 30%. Some even have 50% of women in parliament. But the one thing that we're doing at the CPA is that we're promoting a work called on on gender-sensitive parliaments. And that's the idea that essentially a parliament needs to be a true reflection of civil society and an institution that removes all barriers, cultural, structural, or policy that will inhibit or prevent women from having meaningful and equal participation. And as part of our first dimension of the work that we're doing on gender-sensitive parliament, we look at what we call the equality of participation of women in parliament. And again, that looks and asks questions about how diverse is your parliament, going back to the point that I mentioned before. It's good having women there, but how diverse are the women there? But it also looks at, once they're present in parliament, what's their representation in those committees? So again, we're talking about socioeconomic development. Are women able to sit in finance committees? Are women sitting in health committees? Where are they positioned? Because again, it's not about just having women there as tokens. And that goes back to what Dr. Mecca was mentioning about sometimes the quotas. I think, and again, conversations that we've had with our membership is that sometimes quotas are great, but some of our members or some parliaments notice or feel different about it because they believe that quotas can kind of be tokenistic. And can kind of just simply be you're ticking off and ensuring that women are there. So when we look at, this dimension about equality of participation, we're looking at when the women are there, where are they based? And there's an example of when we did a gender audit or gender, well, we don't like the word audit because parliamentarians are scared of that word audit. So we kind of use the word self-assessment, where it's about us reviewing the parliament and seeing where they are on their gender sensitive journey in terms of becoming an institution that society can look at. So when we did a gender self-assessment of a parliament, that's not in Africa, it's a provincial parliament. Again, historically, they've had great female representation. And I think they thought that would be fine. But when we were doing this audit, we had to engage in interviews with both members of parliament and parliamentary staff, because data can say one thing, or the website can say one thing, but until you speak to the people who are there, then you understand how things operate. So when we had this self-assessment, we were speaking to member of parliament, parliamentary staff, and it was identified to us that not in all those committees in parliament were women represented. And a member actually flagged an issue with a committee on health. And it was revealed that this committee of health was a committee that was simply men on that committee. But when it was flagged that, oh, there's no women a part of this committee, and the committee is single sex, I think the individual who raised, I think they raised it to the parliamentary whip, they thought that it wouldn't be, the absence of a woman would not be important, the committee would be fine, and if it wouldn't be problematic. Until, unknowing to them, there was a committee inquiry that decided to speak on abortion and reproductive choices, i.e. period products. And we know that even within the African continent, period poverty is a huge thing, to the point females cannot go to school. And of course, as you know, that if women don't go to school and not educated and stay at home because of period poverty, that goes back to Dr. Mecca's point, that how are they able to get that education so they can be empowered economically as well to go and live a full, fulfilling life. So it was only until they had that inquiry, when they were like, okay, it was about abortion, reproductive system, and they realized that there's no women involved, that then the committee decided to put a woman in that inquiry. And the woman did participate in the inquiry, and of course it was led through. But then shortly after, the committee did appoint a woman permanently. So evidently, I guess the good takeaway is that the parliament did realize, of course, that they needed a woman there. But imagine if they didn't. Then we then have a parliament who has women in place. But then again, even with the women in place, they're not in specific areas or key areas in which policy, again, with that topic about, abortion and reproductive right, it goes back to the point I made. Women and men, when we talk about gender equality and equity, is different. The experiences of women, well, let's be quite frank, men do not have abortion. Men, women, of course, women, biological people who are born as women, that has female sex, have periods. So that's not necessarily a conversation that men will have complete understanding on. They may have some, but of course, when you don't have women in that room to give that perspective, but to also engage with other stakeholders, be it grassroots organizations, to feed into that, then you are at fear of potentially going down a path. If, let's say, this parliament didn't intervene and have a woman present, then it makes one wonder what would have happened if the woman wasn't there. And that's an example of a parliament that's exceeded for the past 10 years of having 50%. So it goes back to say that having women there is important, but you also need to understand, do they have full access to meaningful political participation? And are their voices embedded?
No, I mean, thank you. I was just tapping my fingers and nodding because I mean that's totally resonates. I mean, given the work that we do, it was quite interesting to talk about, how the word audit sometimes can scare parliamentarians. We're talking about an assessment, which is quite important. Alexa is actually currently on a project, doing a gender assessment of the National Assembly in Nigeria. Not just, I mean, we know what the numbers are when it comes to representation, but even understanding the operational infrastructure, from the clerks to the SLAs to different people within, to the security within the National Assembly. Where do we have gender considerations, and how does this shape, the policy direction of the National Assembly? You talked about something profound, which is the equality of representation. And I think that, when we start distilling this conversation to understand the nuances, we realize that again, this is not a nice to have and a need to have. And the reason I say that is because in 2022, for example, in 2022, I think, I mean, I stand corrected, in Nigeria, on the first month of the International Women's Month, 5 gender-centric bills were thrown out of, a male-dominated national parliament, the right, to indigenship, to citizenship. At the moment, constitutionally, a foreigner who marries a Nigerian man can take a citizenship, but as a man who marries a Nigerian woman, you cannot take a citizenship. So there were certain things. The affirmative action bill around reserve seat bill was also rejected, and it wasn't until then that we had a national uproar around this. And I think the conversation is, haven't you gotten what's been going on for a while? But it was quite interesting to see how this played, such a strong role in a national pushback, right? And I think people began to understand that, wow, if we don't get, it's not even just a conversation around women. It's not about women. This is around, the entire landscape. This is around socioeconomic reality. This is around national development. And I think, that is, why we're even having this conversation, to say, let's pause and stop. Let's understand the nuances. How do we bring different stakeholder categories together? How do we bring the private sector, the third sector, government together, civil society together, to really start distilling this conversation around, the lack of equitable representation and political governance and public leadership, and, what considerations must we start doing? And that's why, again, I will, reference Dr. Emeka's conversation around what are the practical steps that we can take, going from here as institutions, as individuals, as the private sector as well. You said something around, I love the reference, you made in South Africa. And this is why this needs to be a data-driven, evidence-based conversation, so that we stop having loose conversations. You talked about, the active multi-parliamentary caucus, and how this has really institutionalized gender mainstreaming, within the parliament, and how they were able to champion a lot of conversations, especially, we know the domestic abuse situation in Southern Africa, but I mean across Africa, but it's been quite peculiar in that region. And so having those women represented in government obviously means that there's a group of women with lived experiences, that are then able to help the parliament understand, how this affects, not just the women, but also broader society as well. And I think, that really helps us to understand why it's important to have women represented in parliament, not just because like you said, is the immediate outputs, as we use in the space for the wider outcomes, in terms of how they can caucusing, for example, the kind of issues, they talk about, but also is how they then dig deeper into the intersectionality, ensuring that it's not just tokenistic. In Nigeria, for example, within political parties, and even in West Africa generally, you'll see women, they call them the women are known for tying wrappers during election, for cheering on the men. But when it comes to inter-party structures, when it comes to political party leadership, when it comes to delegate selections, you rarely find women occupying significant positions, even at the National Assembly, right? significant communities where you're talking about infrastructure, where you're talking about health and all those, right, you really find women. And so, right, it's important that different stakeholders understand that the conversation around gender equity when it comes to public governance, is quite cross-cutting, from how we have women represented at, this parliament, really shapes the policy direction, so that when we're complaining about dilapidated healthcare infrastructure, or we're complaining about the lack of access to primary healthcare, or we're complaining about out of school children, or we're complaining about, the labor wage gap, or we're complaining about period poverty, we need to know that, the infrastructure essentially governing the policy design, right, and safeguarding, if it's weakened, we're going to keep having this poor outcomes at the end of this. So thank you very much for essentially bringing that on. Yvonne, let me come back to you. Sometimes, I will use my lived experience. I've got a lot of friends from the private sector who are like, okay, you guys can, that conversation around gender equity can be so intense. That's not how we say it. You guys just go on it. Can we please have that person?
Yes, you they hungry.
Okay, can we please mute that person just so that the conversation is not distorted? All right, thank you for that. So even as I was saying, the conversation can seem quite high level, because it's the organizations within development space, that usually have this conversation when it comes to politics. Now, how do we bring this conversation closer to? How do we bring this conversation closer to home? How do we bring it to people, right? The everyday people. How do we get the private sector interested in this conversation? And the reason why I went on to Dr. Emeka and Benita before coming to you is because, is to also have a broadened perspective into, how the policy landscape works, and even how it might affect things like access to finance, how it might affect things like, just the policy direction. Companies in the private sector, many have worked in public affairs in the past, spend millions of dollars, to lobby annually, right? How can private sector, for example, save some of those costs by being more involved? So really for me is, how do we bring this conversation home in a way that is not too high level or overwhelming to private sector players, but where they actually see themselves as meaningful players and actors towards, ensuring that, the public governance landscape, not just politics right now, right, as considering, gender equity. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I really do like that question, because if the private sector isn't paying attention as much as they should be, they are leaving a lot of money on the table. And like you said, they're spending a lot of money lobbying when there is so much more that they can do in really contributing directly. So I would start with the very important stats by the African Development Bank. The African Development Bank launched a program on the affirmative finance action for women in Africa. And this is really just to help facilitate women's access to finance. And in 2019, the G7 leaders pledged $251 million to this program for a specific reason: to unlock $3 billion in private sector funding. Now, this is a cost that really can be lost if there isn't attention actually paid to women's access to finance. And I really appreciate what Dr. Chukwemeka said around women thriving with informal ways of finance. And that's the truth. And one of the things that we can also do from a financial services sector is to also think through, what do we need to do to be able to bridge the gap? And in places like Gaza, for example, movable assets are beginning to be introduced. So things like women being able to use their gold, for example, as collateral. And we all can remember, I don't know, but I had that kind of mom. I had a working mom who invested in gold. I don't know if she saw it as an investment, or maybe all her friends were doing it, but they were buying gold. And when we hit a very severe financial difficulty, because she worked for the public sector, and you know how fickle working for the public sector can be, and we hit a very serious financial. She had to sell most of her gold. She used some of them as collateral. She had to, get access to credit, financial instruments to continue to train us, because some of my siblings had gone off to study abroad, and she was like, nope, you're not coming back home. You're not coming back home. We're going to figure it out. And you see how even with those informal ways of finance that these women are about, how can formal sectors, or how can the financial services sector find a way to bridge the gap, as opposed to migrating these women, taking them out of what they know from the informal ideas of finance and moving them. So what products and programs can we introduce to actually, and I mean, for a financial institution to decide to actually change their collateral and what they accept, there has to be the central bank's approval of that. And there has to be that involvement from a macroeconomic perspective. And so that's where, how do we build those relationships, and how do we make sure that private sector is not just leaving it all to the macroeconomic, pieces and just saying, whatever happens, we're going to be fine. No, but we actually run the risk of losing $3 billion. The private sector really does. And another way you can see this as well is that there are two main sectors in sub-Saharan Africa, especially, that women dominate. And it is the truth. And, we should be able to tell this story more. One is agriculture, and the other is the fashion industry. Now, you think about agriculture and you think about the fact that the risk here is that when we don't have enough women actually struggling to invest in modern technologies for their farms, or inability to invest in assets and livestock, and just really being able to diversify their farms, we are shrinking the productivity of these women. And if you have an industry that is dominated by women, and you can't get the GDP that we're supposed to get from that, then who is that really hurting? And you find that, for example, I'm currently in Canada, in Saskatoon, and this is a very an agriculturally thriving community and city or town. And you find that there are very, very large organizations here that are really feeding this part of the country and even exporting. And you see how far they've taken farming to, you see how far they've taken agriculture. And these are private sector, a lot of people, these women grow their businesses into large private enterprises. And if we're not really helping these women get access to the credit they need, or be as financially literate, or make stronger financial decisions that they need to make, then we're losing a lot of money within the private sector. And then you check out the fashion industry, and the cotton, textile, garment industry in Africa currently produces about $31 billion per annum. And you find that this is also, and within sub-Saharan Africa, this is also an industry that is dominated by women. And you see that women are also struggling here, that they're struggling to tap into high value areas of fashion. And you can see that Africa has we have so much potential, because we should be able to dominate fashion across the world. We should be able to do that, but we're not doing that. We're not tapping. We still have so many other smaller Asian countries even doing way better, being the hubs and sources of manufacturing for large brands across the world. We're supposed to be able to do that, but you see how much money that we're losing, the private sector is losing, right? And there are so many ways that we can really close that gap and land it home. And again, bringing it back to the things that the financial services sector can do, because that's the sector that I represent and speak for, is really thinking about products. Yes, we all think about it as CSR, but we need to begin to see the impact of it beyond CSR and the money that we're losing, and really think about products that begin to help these women, that begin to help women entrepreneurs, that begin to really, really empower them, and a sustainable level of empowerment, that begin to really support women to actually go into public policy, that begin to really, really support women to form things like what the HM Treasury has at the moment, sign up to those sorts of signatories within Africa. We don't really have a very strong women in finance, anything similar right now within the continent. Most of them are just either within local markets or within specific countries. And we don't have anything that, of course, yeah, Africa is very large and it's not a monolith, of course, but we don't even have regional, very strong regional bodies like this that can really, really influence women's access to finance, but not just their access to finance, their representation in these financial institutions. Yes, we might just have one, I mean, in Nigeria currently, do we have between 9 to 12 banks that currently have women at the very top? But how does that also translate to the people reporting to these women? And how are these women also making sure that that they're seeing their roles as more than just making profit for these businesses, but as also doing so much more for the community around them?
Fantastic. I'm going to quickly start from where you stopped. You said something quite interesting. And I will start from the private sector perspective, then I will take it to how history has played out in terms of women that have come on to be presidents of African countries, and the situations that actually led them, to be presidents of this country, and why, sometimes, we look at, what do they call it again? Is it equality of convenience? I think that's one of my friends, termed it as like when they feel it's necessary. Someone actually shared some story around the world, the First World War, where I think in one of the countries, right, they realized that because the men had gone to war, economy, they had to bring the women out, and because the women were busy taking care of the family, they had to build nurseries. And soon after the First World War, those nurseries, again, they were not funded or facilitated again, and then Second World War came again. So that's the equality of convenience, plays out here as well. And now you're talking about, how we've seen the emergence in Nigeria, for example, where we have about 10 banks with female CEOs now, but saying how has this translated within, the junior to the mid-level executives? Are we seeing, or even from the mid-level executives to C-suite executives, how are we seeing the emergence of female leaders here? Because also economic power, when we have women, speaking to what Bennett said around the caucus in South Africa, in the private sector, the more you have women who are stronger and economically capable, the more they can also even fundraise for women in politics. Again, we fundraised for some women during the 2023 election, and it was one of the most excruciating processes because the bandwidth and the social will was not there. But we were able to partner with Chimamanda Adichie and another private sector caucus, organization to raise funds for some women that were running. And now it's not even the size of the fund, it's that we started something that we can build on as a model going into the next general election and beyond, just like Emily's List does in the US, and She Should Run and the likes, where they have funded a lot of pro-choice women to go into politics. So, this is so important when it comes to community building, caucusing, and also just creating that power of agency. And then secondly, you said something around, when you were talking about the role of agriculture, the orange economy, when it comes to even the fashion industry and how, it's valued, the fashion industry, for example, is valued at around $31 billion. And how a lot of women are struggling to play in the high value aspect of this value chain. It still goes on to, again, is the lack of understanding on, number one, consumer behavior, the lack of understanding on what is powering, the supply chain, and also how this affects, how government pays attention to policy environment. Because you would think that, any government that is forward thinking, or any government that really cares about national development or social, or any government that even cares about, their GDP or what money is coming to them, for the lack of better words, will think about powering, such value chain to then see how they can triple their income comes down, the truth is that it cuts across. You know, when you empower a woman, you essentially see the multiplier effect. It affects the family, it impacts, you know, the children, a whole lot. So really is that, you know, understanding how we delve deeper into the concept of gender equity is so important. Earlier this year, actually, after 4 years of running Electa, we over the past 4 years, actually, up until December 2023, a lot of our work was focused around women political participation. And people kept asking, how do you leave what you were doing to go into this? And I said, look, I just feel like, you know, we're playing tone deaf and we're essentially treating the symptoms and not the root cause. Because again, as we keep complaining, but we forget that when women are not in key areas of decision making, nothing can happen. You know, I've sat in parliamentary sessions. You know, it is about numbers. When you don't have the numbers, you cannot pass a bill, which is why it's so important to have women at this, you know, critical decision-making functions. Now, what we then said was, look, we cannot isolate women political participation from economic development. We cannot isolate women political participation, you know, from what is happening with, you know, within the broader landscape. So we decided to, you know, to scale our work to now focus on 3 critical components. First is women public life participation. So beyond just political participation is now public life. How do we start considering the role of women in public sector reform, you know, in citizen engagement, in political and, you know, engagement in public sector governance. And then the second is women economic empowerment. And that brings me to what you said around, you know, the role of women and looking at some fit for purpose financial instruments. And based on that, we created you know, our first initiative, which we're currently building, called the Africa Female Founders Collective, which is essentially, we realize the fundamental problem. Now, you have a couple of women, you know, within the startup space that, you know, are beginning to raise, you know, we've seen the numbers, you know, it's still a bit stagnant, but women are actively playing. But what we've seen is the ability for those women to scale, right? To scale is still a problem. And that's the issue we have. Women keep playing at the micro level. Again, this is still a function of the policy environment. Because again, if the government of the country, right, cannot give incentives to investors to ensure that they essentially consider gender considerations. This takes me back to what Dr. Chukwuemeka said about the World Bank project, where the VAP Act we've been trying to pass in the country, domesticate for so long. But now with this new financial facility to state governments, the incentive was, you know, domesticating the VAP Act. And as a result of that, you've had several states domesticated because they wanted that, you know, that access as well. So again, going back to the startup space, we decided to create the Africa Female Founders Collective, saying, how do we create a network agency to ensure that we can start partnering with more stakeholder groups to improve the investability and the scalability of female-led and owned businesses across Africa? Why can't a fashion designer, right, across Africa, you know, start powering and take advantage of the Africa Free Trade Continental Agreement, right, to start trading across Africa? So a lot of those conversations, again, this is why it's important to have this conversation, saying this is not just a mediocre conversation. This is not just a basic conversation. It is as deep as it gets. It affects everyone. It affects the socioeconomic landscape that we see at the moment. And at the end of the day, it affects our individual lived experience. So thank you so much for that, Eben. Ina, I'm going to come back to you because I know that you've had challenges with your network. If you can hear me, can you please just say something so that I can come to you? I'm dying to engage you on this particular next question.
Yes, I'm here. So I think I've decided to go off just for my connectivity. Yeah.
No, that works. I mean, you said something profound. You joined the parliament at the age of 23. That is, wow, that is fantastic. And I love it. I love it. I love the fact that in Senegal at the moment, we have a 40-year-old also leading the country as well. So it's really good to see young people play now.
Thank you so much.
How would you say your role as a woman, a young woman? So I would just say, I use a woman loosely. Let's consider different dimensions, right? How has it influenced your policy direction how do you think it has shaped, the work that the parliament in Namibia is doing at the moment? I follow you on LinkedIn rather, and I know that recently, you were pushing for some policy around, I think education, to ensure that, some of those policies are localized. So let's talk more about your work as a young parliamentarian, as a woman, as an elected woman in the national parliament in Namibia, and how that really is shaping the policy landscape, and why it is important for you to see more women, within this landscape, but across Africa. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think I would commit a great injustice if I do not mention that my entrance and the entrance of other young people into parliament was met with a lot of resistance. And not just resistance because we are young people, but primarily because we are female. Now, one of the things that we really try to do, and that I've tried to do since my entry into parliament, is one, I chose my hill, and that was young people, and has always been young people. So from the very first year, I've always put young people at the center of whatever advocacy work that I've done within parliament. Now, if you look at in Southern Africa, for example, most countries in Southern Africa struggle with unemployment. I mean, it's not even just in Southern Africa. If you look at Africa itself, and many countries in Africa, one of the biggest challenges is the youth unemployment crisis. Now, but if you look at the statistics, you would find that more women are affected by youth unemployment as compared to men. This is one of the reasons, is because the output of young females from secondary school, the output of young females from institutions of higher learning, most times is higher than the male counterparts. One of the things that we did was, one of the first things that I did was to bring a motion on youth unemployment. It was adopted. And you're right when you say that without the numbers in parliament, you are unlikely to succeed in whatever agenda you want to pursue. So one of the things that I had to do from the onset is understand that I needed both sides of the aisle in the House to get my motions adopted, or to have any successful advocacy work, not just within parliament, but also outside parliament. So there's a very important skill that I think is often overlooked, and that is the ability to lobby different sides of the House. So you do need, whilst I'm from opposition, I still understood that if I'm gonna get anything done, I also need to consult and lobby members of the ruling party. Secondly, what we did was we ran an international, we ran a nationwide campaign on youth unemployment, because very often what we do, not just as young people, but also as female leaders in the political space, is that whilst we are advocating for these important issues, we leave out the grassroots, we leave out and often detach our advocacy from the people that are concerned. In this case, youth unemployment affected young people mostly. And so it was important for me to not just bring something to parliament because I've Googled or I understand statistics, but also it was important that I had this conversation outside of parliament with the affected young people. I think one of the things that I've really tried to do since my entry into parliament is also to try and sharpen my own skills. For example, I'm still a student. I'm now pursuing my master's in international relations and diplomacy. One of the other things that I do is I really try to not limit myself to just gender issues or youth issues. And so I serve as a member of the Public Accounts Committee. We deal primarily with audit reports. We deal with where the state has an interest and money is spent. I also serve as a member of the Constitutional and Legal Affairs Committee. So that is constitutional work, it's legal work. I just recently, I was nominated to serve on the Natural Resources Committee. We're dealing with resources. We want young women to have a seat at the decision-making table, where we are talking about the allocation of fishing quotas in my country. We're talking about the ownership of mines, and where women are, or how we can find women and locate women in that particular space of mining, industries such as agriculture, fishing, and so forth. So I really think that it's not enough to just have women in parliament. It's not enough to just have women or want to have women speak about gender issues. But I think it's also important that we invest in having women that understand the finances of their countries, in having women understand that they have a place and they must have some sort of role to play, and they must be located in important industries such as mining sector, for example. You want to see women drive successful mining companies where they're able not only to empower themselves and their families, but the society at large. The previous speaker spoke about how it's important that we need to also begin to incentivize political parties to encourage, political representation of women or youth. I think while it is a good idea, there are dangers to ideas like to incentivizing political organizations. What you would find, especially in Africa, is that political parties would either use women as campaign tools, as the images of campaigns, and not necessarily give them real power when they're elected into those positions. So most of the time, it becomes almost as if they do this to tick boxes and for political expediency. Why? Because it's an attractive idea to have a woman at the forefront. It's an attractive thing to see a young person on a poster who's 23 who's going to parliament. But what we end up with very often is that we end up in a situation where those people aren't given real power, but rather almost appear as poster child or poster children of a campaign and not necessarily serve their purpose. I think also beyond that, what I find quite interesting is not just in my parliament, but also in my interactions with other members of parliament from other countries, is that women are very reluctant to speak on the floor during the debate, but are more active and much more active and effective at committee level. So a committee level is a much smaller space where different members of political parties would then form that committee, and they deal with, petitions, they deal with issues at a much micro level, a much more easier managed level. And it's interesting that women would prefer to be active at that platform and not necessarily during debates of the House. And that's one thing that we're really struggling with, especially in Southern Africa as well. You have women elected into positions, but yet I think maybe we need to now run projects and programs around, confidence. But I think confidence comes from knowledge about a particular issue. So if you don't have knowledge, and if you don't invest in, sharpening your skills, sharpening your knowledge on various and diverse issues, you struggle to even take on a debate on the floor. And most times you are found reading a speech on an issue that you actually know about, but wouldn't necessarily know how to put in words or present in Parliament. I just wanted to say that, it's having a woman in a position basically guarantees so many things, not just for the family or the household, but also for society. When you have women representation, you have societal representation. And it's one thing that I've seen myself. We have women leading our committees on finance, women, we have a ministry on gender, women empowerment and equality. And you see really where there are women, there is impactful work done. And I think it's something that we need to continue investing in. And one of the, perhaps if there's a sector that is exemplary or has.
Oh no, we cannot lose you now, Ina. I think this is such an important conversation. So I'm gonna wait on for you. And while we're waiting on for you, I'm just gonna encourage people to drop any questions that they might have in the question box. We're gonna try to wrap up the conversation within the next 10 to 15 minutes.
My region in Southern Africa,
please,
it's
okay,
the private sector investment together. And so, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right, I'll just end there for now.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I think you packed so much, within this 3 minutes that you spoke. And I think for me, that's so important because again, you have shown us the evidence of having people like yourself, young people, women in governance and the kind of issues that you begin to push. A lot of our speakers today have talked about, having, the importance of equality and representation, essentially. I think, Benny, you talked about that, and through one of the initiatives that you were saying is not just about, the women. Yvonne, thank you so much. I hear that you might need to join, you might need to drop off now. So as you leave, before I come back to rounding up Ina's conversation, any final words on this discourse as we'll let you go, but we can't thank you enough for joining us today. So over to you, Yvonne.
I think everybody has said so many things about final words, but I'm really glad that you brought the private sector into the conversation. And it's important, even though, I mean, excluding the fact that I work in the financial services sector, I can't see how the private sector can be really impactful in this conversation without the financial services sector. And that's why even, for example, in the UK, there is a large conversation around socioeconomic mobility and class inequality, because it's worst in the financial services sector. It's the worst. And it's sad because this is a sector that also really it's in charge of a lot of financial instruments. It's not just about the jobs they provide. They're in charge, in charge of a lot of financial instruments that really, really make the economy get to the point where we want it to get to. So I would say everyone leaving here today or in this conversation, just think about what is the one act of inclusion that you can do. Inclusion can start from small behaviors. There are things such as micro inclusion. It's not just when you're doing the amazing work that Bijoke is doing, or when you're doing what Benit is doing, or when you're in parliament like Ina. It's not just then that you can actually be an inclusive person or actually promote inclusion. And I would give an example. I went for an event in Austria, and I was the only Black woman at the event. And towards the evening, all the other women had left. So I was practically now just the only Black person, the only Black woman, and the only woman at the event. And they were taking a group photo. And I was standing on the side and didn't know they were taking a group photo. And they had taken about 3. And then someone said, I think there's actually a woman somewhere. Let's get her to join the photo because this has to be balanced. 2 things. I mean, I would have criticized to say, I can't believe you're just including me in the photo because you just want the statistical balance. But at the same time, I was able to think about positive intention and even see the step towards, okay, you even acknowledged that I was there. You even acknowledged that I should also be included. So I focused on the behavior. I focused on the act of inclusion. Yes, we can do more with the mindset eventually, but the behavior is important. So think about ways that you can be more inclusive. Think about behaviors. If you're on a call, ask people for their opinions, ask women for their opinions as well. Advocate for women in the workplace. If you see a woman who's doing a great job, speak about her to someone else who is in a position to offer her an opportunity. So sponsor women as well. If you know a woman that just needs a laptop, that just needs a course, that just needs a bank account or whatever it is, sponsor women. Those are actually acts of inclusion that anyone can do. You don't have to be running a lecture to be a very inclusive person. But I love the amazing work that all of my panelists are doing and that the hosts are doing as well.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. It's a very nice way to wrap it. And, talking about the seeds of change, we're hoping that everyone can take that on board. I wish you a very good rest of the evening here in Nigeria. And, I know you're a few hours behind, but thank you so much for joining us today. So we'll let you go now and we'll catch up with you offline. Thank you. All right, to the rest of the panelists, I'm going to come back to what Ina said around, just our lived experience of being a young person and how this has shaped the ability to lobby for certain things. She also talked about, well done, for those committees, which are really critical, from public account to constitutional and legal affairs, and the natural resources committee. You said something around the importance of competency, which is something we cannot, overestimate, and essentially having, that knowledge to be able to talk about, certain things and in certain contexts, right? So within the national parliament, you talked about women, not really standing up, during parliamentary sessions. It might be for fright, it might be for the lack of confidence, whatever it is, but it's also given a nuanced perspective, even into what some of we organizations must consider as we begin to design interventions that can further support women, into those spaces and ensure that they thrive and they occupy meaningfully. Again, going back to what Benita said. So thank you very much for that. I'm just going to take, before we take the final words from, our panelists, because I know that we're pressed for time, and I thank everyone for sticking with us this far. We are going to open the floor to about one to three questions, depending on how short they are. So I would say that let's see if we have any questions. Otherwise, you can use the raise hand button, and I think I will unmute to speak. Now, this is what I want to say around speaking. Let us stay on the point. Let us be very short and concise so that we can consider other people that might want to ask questions. And also, please consider the time of our panelists who have dropped a lot of things to be here today, and even consider your own time, who joined this conversation today. So it has to be very short, it has to be very concise, and it has to speak to the issue. If you're dropping a comment, please make it very short as well. So under 1 minute, we would expect that conversation. So I am going to look at this, and I'm going to start with Chisom Ogbumo. I do hope I did not murder your name. Please, I'm going to ask you to, or the team can please ask her to unmute so that she can pose a question or give a comment very shortly. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's been a very insightful session. So my question is for Dr. Chukwuemeka. He was speaking about affirmative action, and it's very interesting, and I would love to get more insights as to what the UN Women is proposing in details. Most likely, of course, I know that he's not able to answer all of the questions by this session, but is there somewhere we can read or get more insights on the directives on what, again, which of the women, the target audience in terms of the women, and what exactly they would be doing with the affirmative action in terms of the government? That's my question. So if there's somewhere to read on, I would kindly appreciate that. If I can have a personal conversation with you too as well about it, then I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that precise question, Chisom. I think we're going to take the questions first, and then we'll call on the panelists to answer. I'm sure that there's tons and tons of work that the UN Women has done on that, so I can imagine that it's great for that question. I've also asked my team to share a link to a report from our Policy and Research Center, which essentially focuses on temporary special measures, and also just distills the conversation around affirmative actions and how it has played out in different parts of Africa. So please feel free to use that report if you feel is beneficial to you. Now I am going to unmute the other person. I can see their end up at the moment, and that is before I do that, please, there is a poll at the moment. We would be most grateful if you can please share a response to the poll. Now I'm going to ask the team to please unmute Amarachukwu Onwokokoro. I do hope I didn't murder the name again. Please, ask your question. Thank you.
It's fine. Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Hi, my name is Amarachukwu Onwokokoro. So my question is actually also to I think Dr. Chukwuemeka. My question is also to him as well. My question was, he mentioned something about incentives, and I wanted to get more information on what he meant by incentives, because I was just thinking, like, wouldn't that make the women being elected looked at like, oh, we're just letting them in because they're giving us something? Or maybe I didn't really understand what he meant by incentives. So if he can elaborate more on that. That was my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amarachukwu. And just speaking to what Ina said, from our last conversation, she also touched on that as well. So I think it's only fair that we let Dr. Chukwuemeka, answer that question. And it's quite interesting that the questions that we have, are yet to the man of the house. Again, talking about the power of representation, no matter how, how do we say it again? I don't want to say no matter how little, because having one man in this conversation is very powerful. But again, I think no matter the skill, having representation is so important. And then, leveraging that. So over to you, Dr. Chukwuemeka. You have two questions. One is asking around affirmative action. The other one is asking, just to share some more context around the incentives that you mentioned. Again, speaking to what Honorable Ina said around, how she might disagree with incentive and how that might translate into a disturbing culture in terms of how political parties might want to exploit these good intentions from partners. Over to you, Dr. Chukwuemeka, if you're still here, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm still here. So I can answer the question on affirmative actions. There are several affirmative actions, and you can have affirmative actions in all sectors, not necessarily only to gender. It could be affirmative actions to promote specific actions within a sector. So for example, UN Women is currently implementing a program in Nigeria, across West Africa actually, and Nigeria is one of them, on the procurement process. What we tend to do is to have affirmative procurement policies that creates the space for women entrepreneurs, women-owned businesses to thrive in the procurement process. The reason why we have that affirmative action is because from evidence, we've seen that women-owned businesses and women entrepreneurs do not participate and do not benefit from public procurement processes. So for example, in Kaduna State, the government is about to sign an affirmative procurement policy where 20% of all contracts on goods will go to women and women-owned businesses. 10% of all services will go to women and women-owned businesses, and 5% of all procurement on the works will go to women-owned businesses. And this is based on evidence from what we've seen historical from women's participation. So that is an affirmative action. And this is a quota that is exclusive for women. It is there not because women will be given an easy chance. The competitiveness, the compliance, the thresholds are not reduced. What we are saying is that we've reserved this quota for women who meet the requirements to come and compete amongst themselves and get those contracts. So all the thresholds, all the compliance are being kept. It's just that a space is being kept for women to come and try. And really deep, you can see clear benefits. With just that this policy is going to be approved, we've seen commercial banks now saying, oh, if this happens, it means we will now have women who will need contract financing. So let us start designing financial instruments that will help those women, because we know that women are going to get it. So let us now start having part of our women, their women banking, to have something on contract financing for women-owned businesses. And this is the idea, and it's an innovative way of injecting money into women-owned businesses. Now,
please continue.
For incentives. Incentives do work. If incentives do not work, they will not exist. What we need in nature and the dynamics of incentives. Incentives could be in the form of subsidies. Incentives could be in the form of policies. Incentives in the form of collaboration. That is as handouts. Incentives work. If incentives don't work, they will not exist. In fact, in economics, incentives are used to boost economies. They are used to boost specific sectors. We've seen instances where the government has to subsidize specific private sector organizations. We've seen that with banks. We've seen when, during financial crisis, when the American government introduced some form of quantitative easing for specific sectors. We've seen during COVID, where the government were giving people incentives to consume. Incentives work. What we need to do for incentives for female participation in politics is to complement whatever incentives we have with behavioral insights of how women behave in politics. If you do not do that, using those evidence to design those incentives, the incentives will fail. We also have incentives that have failed. We also have policies that are based on nudging that have also failed. But we also see those that have worked. So where the hard work is now is for us to design incentives in such a way that you not turn out to handouts and give away to women. I can tell you, for example, what we are trying to do with political parties in Nigeria. We are creating, for UN Women, we have a program on that. We're trying to create an incentive for political parties within their own structure to create a pathway for women to participate in politics. And I can tell you for free, the incentive we're giving them is we're training them on understanding gender. And we've been doing that over a long period of time, to the extent that UN Women in Nigeria is even seen as like a family member for most of these political parties. So anytime they say, oh, we remember, yes, we have to include. That is an incentive itself. So what concerns us is not that incentives don't work. It's understanding behavioral insights of how women thrive in politics. What are the risks for women if they want to come out as elected positions? What are the risks for women when they want to come out for appointed positions? The risks for women who are elderly are different from the risks for women who are young. The risks for women who have been in appointed positions for a longer period of time is different for a woman who has never been in appointed position, who has never been in politics before, and is coming from the private sector. So you see, the incentives cannot be one, it's not a one size fits all. It has to be a incentive that is flexible and meets the heterogeneous nature of women. Incentives do work. It is done everywhere in the world. What we need to do is learn the behavioral insight, evidence, research. How does it work in this context? How does it work in northern Nigeria? How does it work in southern Nigeria? How does it work in local government? How does it work? Believe me, incentives even work informally. When you hear sometimes, oh, they are trying to dish out positions, they're trying to negotiate, those are incentives, as well as disincentives also. But I don't like talking about disincentives because they have punitive measures to it. I believe more on incentives to induce people to act in a certain way. Sometimes it could be incentives, sometimes it could be nudges. So what is left for us is now to sit down, understand, create this behavioral insights, which is very expensive, before we can now start developing those incentives. Over to you.
Fantastic. I mean, Dr. Chukwemeka, thank you so much. And this is why we needed an economist in our midst to really distill this. I like the fact that you said, incentives are not necessarily financial. These can be in different dimensions and formats, and it could be as, just ensuring that you're training the leadership to understand the nuances, or, what the World Bank, for example, is doing with the state governance. So in different dimensions, essentially, that it can play, and that you're saying, even from the law of economics, that incentives do work. I'm sure that, we do have several people have very varied opinions about this, but in the interest of time, we'll try to wrap up the conversation. It's been really insightful, and I'm just really going to invite our panelists to give the 1 minute final thought, to this conversation. It's a lengthy one. It's one that, we can't have the entire extent of this conversation today. As I mentioned, this is the first of the series. This is supposed to be the broad perspective. The next one we might be focused around agricultural productivity. The next one we have might be, for example, even talking about procurement and how, that's even, helps with financial inclusion and unlock some socioeconomic potential, economically as well. So really for us, this is the first of many to really distill the conversation, to measure progress, and to make positive recommendation. Now, what's going to come from this session? We're going to, create a policy brief from the different contributions and ensure that it is publicly accessible. We will keep having this conversation as an organization. And so, of course, we're very glad, in terms of the richness and the depth of the conversation today. I don't know if we still have Benit on the conversation. Let me just start so that I move this a little bit. So Benit, please, can you share your final words, in terms of the conversation around the interconnectedness of inclusive politics, policy, and socioeconomic development?
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. But again, the one takeaway, I guess, from all the panelists I've spoken is that, number one, there's a need for women to be represented, not only in politics, but in all in all sectors in society. So my key takeaway is that, I guess, is the need for continued participation and collaboration, because the truth of the matter is, like you said, all these issues are all interconnected, and no body, no organization, no sector can do this alone. And that's one thing that we at the CPA, we do welcome and encourage, collaboration. As we know, politicians are busy, and some parliaments also have an issue of resources, but I think it's key for sectors, and also with politicians who are in this call, but also us at the CPA, to tap into those best practices where we can have and learn from the experiences, such as the things that Dr. Emeka was highlighting. There may be information that people are not privy to. So I guess my key takeaway is that, partnership is key, but also someone raised something about capacity building. I just wanted to flag that the CPA last year and in 2022, did a workshop on gender champions and about having allyship, where we were, again, speaking on what you had mentioned, and the member from Namibia mentioned about women who are not confident in public speaking. So that's training that we partner with civil society organization, grassroots organizations there as well, and specialists within the media to support, women so they can feel confident to enter the parliamentary arena, which historically has been predominantly male, but even the setup of parliament is kind of a battling side when you've got the opposition and government there, so it can be daunting. So again, just leave it there. Key takeaway is, of course, increased partnership and collaboration with persons from all sectors to ensure that we are taking a step forward in gender equality, but we're not duplicating efforts as well.
Fantastic. We're taking efforts, but we're not duplicating efforts, in gender equality. Thank you so much, and well done for the good work you do on the CPA. I'm gonna end with Honorable Ines. So over to you, Dr. Chukwuemeka. Any final words in terms of the focus of this conversation?
Yes, thank you very much. To foster integration across all the teams that we are discussing today, I think we should use both immediate policies, short-term policies, as well as long-term policies. It's important that we try and treat some of the symptoms now so that women can also survive, while we also have a plan for a more structured intervention over a longer period of time. There's a complementarity of this short-term and long-term intervention that will, in the long term, also lead to structural changes in the society, the reduction of those social norms that limit women, as well as breaking down some of those barriers. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chukwuemeka. You talked about the complementarity of, short-term policies and long-term policies, what I call, the survival and sustainability, model, which is essentially, people in a survival mode, women need to survive. There's an immediate problem, but of course, we're considering sustainable development in the long term. Thank you very much, for that rich insight. And over to you, Honorable Insight. What is your take up on this conversation? What is your recommendation, and what are you leaving us with, on this conversation today?
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me as part of this conversation. I think I've learned a lot, especially from the finance perspective as well, and how that really works. But I think what I would recommend, and as a way forward, or something that we can do now, not just in my region, but also in Africa generally, what I've picked up over the years is that sometimes most of the programs that are designed to promote and advance gender or women empowerment, equality and equity, often become very broad. And because they are too broad, they lose their essence. So for example, if I design a program as a finance institution, for example, or financial institution, and I'm using a very specific example in Namibia, for example, there's a program under the Development Bank of Namibia, and of course, the intent and the idea, of course, was to promote the participation of women in business. So whatever sector, whether it's agriculture, and so forth. But what becomes a huge problem is that the program is often too broad, and objectives aren't as specific. Sometimes I think we really need to begin to work with so that they address specific issues and are not really as broad, because when it's too broad, it loses its essence, and you would actually lose track of your expected outcome or what you would have wanted women to get from that particular program. So I think generally we need to reassess and relook the strategies that we put in place to ensure that the intention and the outcome actually marry and are not as divorced. So thank you very much for that, for everything, for the conversation as well.
Thank you so much,